This is The Baseline, discussing the hot button topics of the NBA.
Welcome, everybody. You're tuned to The Baseline. Callie Warren Shaw discussing the hot button topics of the NBA. Breaking news as we are living and breathing it all in the league right now. The Memphis Grizzlies have parted ways with their head coach, David Fizdale. We kid you not, I almost fell out my seat reading what has transpired. But right now, that is the hottest topic that is happening right now. And we have got it on lock to break it all down. Let me roll out the red carpet to my right-hand man, 50 grand, NBA aficionado, www.shawsports.net, Big Kahuna PNC. My brother from another mother, Mr. Warren Shaw, repping out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Certainly not out of Memphis right now, because if we were in Memphis right now, we would be all up in the locker room trying to get a handle on what just transpired right now with the firing of David Fizdale.
Yeah, man. You know, as always, salute to all defense listeners of NBA Baseline, man. This thing has me twisted, bro. I just don't understand what happened here. But hopefully, our guy coming in will be able to shed some light on this situation, because I think we all have the Grizzly Bear Blues, after seeing this news from Fizdale. Definitely a guy who became a fan favorite. And really seemed to be a part of that Memphis community as well too. So firing like this is gonna take a hold. And he was only there a year, but we all talked about, he's really just assimilated to that grit and grind mentality, et cetera, et cetera. So it will be interesting to see how the community handles this, and more so the locker room as well too. I can't wait for the quotes and things to come out of practice, and the shoot around or whatever it is, over the next coming days, and see what Gasol and people like that have to say, man. But we have a great guest who's going to help us break this down, man. This is definitely a perplexing situation, and that's why it's an emergency podcast.
Yeah, out in Memphis, man, the guy who said that he refuses to be outrooked just got outshook by the Memphis Grizzlies organization. So we have our man, Joe Mullinax from SB Nation's Grizzly Bear Blues, also the host of the Grizzly Bear Blues live on Blog Talk Radio. He's going to be on board in a few moments to help us discuss and break down this tumultuous situation that has obviously spilled over from this past weekend with regards to Marc Gasol, the Memphis Grizzlies organization, and the fate of David Fizdale. So please keep us on lock. Once again, get at my man Shaw at Shaw Sports NBA, or get at me at GameFace Lee. The show's Twitter handle at NBA Baseline. Available on all the major platforms: iTunes, Stitcher Radio, Microsoft TuneIn, Player FM, Google Music, Roku channel. Also available on iHeartRadio. Be sure to check us out. We are live and direct via the Almighty Ballers Network. Basketball 24/7. You want it, they got it. And the Baseline NBA podcast is featured exclusively on there as well too. We're also featured exclusively on 16 Wins a Ring. So be sure to get all of the great NBA content to read via the 16 Wins a Ring website. And then also check us out exclusively on Dash Radio. So if you don't have any of those other platforms, you can also catch us on Dash Radio on the Nothing But Net program. The Baseline NBA podcast is featured exclusively on there as well too. Download any of those platforms. Allow us to be your go-to resource discussing all things happening in the association. You know how we do, and you know how we roll. It's time now for the breakdown.
Time to break it
down to the bone gristle.
All right, time now for the breakdown. Callie Warren Shaw of the Baseline NBA podcast. And here with us to talk about the breaking news with reference to the firing of head coach David Fizdale, the Memphis Grizzlies' former head coach. We got our man who always has his finger on the pulse of all things happening with the Memphis Grizzlies, site manager for SB Nation's Grizzly Bear Blues, our man Joe Mullinax. Joe, thanks for hopping on board with us. I know we're burning the midnight oil tonight with this breaking news regarding David Fizdale, brother.
I think that the Memphis Grizzlies and all these other NBA teams, they need to understand, those of us that podcast, like me as a site manager for an SB Nation blog, I have a day job. I have a life. I have a daughter. I have a wife. And they need to be more considerate when they make these breaking decisions so that we don't have to be doing these things. Well, obviously I'm kidding, but it's awesome to be back on with you guys. I love your guys' show. I appreciate being on with you, and I'm happy to try to make sense of the craziness that is what's happened the past, since we're recording here about midnight Eastern time, the past 9 hours with the Memphis Grizzlies, even 8 hours, even less.
Joe, that's exactly the reason why we needed you to be on here, because, myself and Shaw, we're really we've been trying to rack our brain and kind of scrummage through all of the different articles that have been released, and all of the different perspectives that are being given, and it really just doesn't seem to jive. I think what it comes down to at the end of the day is Marc Gasol was unhappy that he got benched, and he made he went and had a tip, had it out, talking to owner Robert Pera and probably with Chris Wallace. And they just decided, you know what, things just aren't working out with you, David Fizdale. I mean, even though you did get us, in the playoffs last year, things just aren't working out. And so we're just, let's just go ahead and part ways. And I just don't understand how this is beneficial for a Memphis Grizzlies ball club that continues to struggle to, to wean itself in the thrust of what we talk about here and staying on top of what's happening in today's NBA.
Well, let me ask you this. I'll answer your question by starting with a question. If you had to choose between parting with someone who had, 2 or 3 year contract, $8 million maybe on that contract, I'm guesstimating, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, of David Fizdale, or 2 or 3 years, $75 million, a lot harder to get out of. If you had to choose, which guy are you going to have to, maybe if you don't necessarily completely agree or think that they're completely innocent in the situation, who are you going to side with? To me, that's part of this circumstance. Is David Fizdale is a victim of circumstance. It's a combination of things. The Grizzlies' current 8-game losing streak is not an accident. They're not healthy. First and foremost, Mike Conley is not there. You're asking a lot of guys to be outside of roles and do things that they shouldn't be asked to do at this stage in their careers. Mario Chalmers is a starting point guard, for goodness sakes. You got Dylan Brooks, who's a second-round pick, who's been a pleasant surprise, but you've got him as a starter. Those two as a starting backcourt against C.J. McCollum and Damian Lillard. Are we surprised? I guess that's my thing. Are we surprised that they're losing? I'm not. I really am not. I picked them to win because I'm a Grizzlies blogger and site manager. But I think that if you take off the Beale Street blue colored glasses and you look at what this roster is without Mike Conley, without Brandon Wright, with pieces that are kind of mismatched, you knew going into this season that you had to have risks like Tyreek Evans, who has hit so far, Chandler Parsons, who has hit so far. But you needed a healthy Mike Conley. You needed a healthy Marc Gasol to be competitive in the Western Conference, and you don't have that. You haven't had Brandon Wright for the past few games. You missed JaMychal Green for a big chunk of the season so far. First off, they're not healthy. Secondly, David Fizdale, again, not immune to criticism. His rotations have been confusing, even in situations where, with the health the way that it is, you can't play Jarrell Martin, who barely made your NBA team, and Ben McLemore, who's coming off of a foot injury, young player who underachieved with the Sacramento Kings, one of those swings and misses, at least so far in terms of reclamation projects. You can't play them for big minutes together in a game and expect for things to go well. But that's what David Fizdale has done. You can't be down by 5 or 6 points to the Brooklyn Nets at home and bench your best player who gives you your best shot at winning that game. You can't do that. It's a combination of things that have really led to Fizdale being where he is now, on the outs with the Grizzlies, literally. And David Fizdale has been very big on culture, whether it's a social activist, which I think one of his greatest, it's hard to have a legacy in just a little over a year, but one of the greatest things David Fizdale did in Memphis was, be that social activist. And whether you agreed or disagreed with his viewpoints, he used his platform in a way that was meant to try to better something that he was passionate about. And I think that you can respect that, again, regardless of how you view it. And in Memphis, he was viewed favorably for his viewpoints. He wants to build culture. He believes in developing a winning culture. Marc Gasol wants to play winning basketball. And I think that something that kind of got missed along the way is they both have different definitions of what it means to have a successful basketball organization. Marc wants to play really good basketball on the court with really good players. He wants to play the right way. Fizdale wants to play the right way too. Obviously, he wants to win, but he believes you build that through buy-in to something off of the court as well, a cultural aspect. I don't think Mark and Fizdale saw eye to eye, not just on that, but on other things. And if you have to choose, as I began this with, between the guy who has a contract that's a little easier to swallow and a guy who, if you try to trade him, you're going to get 75 cents on the dollar, and your blowing up tank isn't going to really make you that much better because of all the other resources that you've piddled away over the past few years trying to extend the grit and grind era. It's a tough choice, but I think it's one that you may not agree with, but if you really step back and you look at it, you can understand a little bit more.
So how much of this really boils down to, a pseudo LeBron James versus David Blatt situation where Gasol is, and Fizdale just didn't see eye to eye, and now that coach is gone. Like, how much of that is really the root of the problem? I know you just laid it out again in terms of the roster, the build-up, whatever, but this is also a Grizzlies organization that has struggled with coaching issues, for whatever. Sometimes it has been the coaching problem, but sometimes there's a bit of administration as well, too. How much of this right now do you point to, like, listen, Gasol and Fizdale just didn't like each other?
And to add to Shaw's point, Joe, before you answer, I mean, this is the fourth
Sure.
head coach in 5 years,
Absolutely.
right? So I think I understand where Shaw's coming from as he asked this particular question, because it almost seems like now this is becoming a bucking trend, which I don't know. Again, if all signs point to what you're saying, I can completely agree with. I see that as well, but then you can't ignore this turnover tree that tends to be growing when it comes to the head coaching position in Memphis.
Oh no, I think that as with most things in life, fellas, it's a little bit of everything. To point your finger at David Fizdale and say he's a bad NBA coach, that's not true. David Fizdale is going to get another shot in the NBA at some point, and I think he's going to be a good NBA head coach. It's just not going to be in Memphis. It's not entirely on Marc Gasol. Marc Gasol is not some team destroyer. That's not his personality. That's not his MO. I don't think he called Robert Pera after being benched in the fourth quarter and said, you got to get rid of this guy. I don't think that happened. It's a combination of things. I do think the clashing of personalities was part of it, but I also think that you have to understand that Fizdale was 50-51 in 100 games and had lost over 100 regular season games, or a little more than 100, and had lost the last 8. There's real concern about losing a locker room in that place. And you have to keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, it's not as easy as to say, okay, tank Grizzlies, tank. Who would be the leading guys or team to try to get Marc Gasol right now? The Cleveland Cavaliers was one of the sexy teams I saw people mentioning. Oh, Cleveland could trade, Kevin Love for Marc Gasol straight up. What good does that do the Memphis Grizzlies? That does them no good. And that, if you ask me, Cleveland might look at that and say, I'm not giving you that. I'll give you Tristan Thompson and Amon Shumpert and maybe a future first-round pick. Oh, and by the way, it's not the 2018 Brooklyn one you want. You're not getting full value for Marc Gasol at this stage in the game. So you have to kind of have that perspective and say, okay, I have Mike Conley, who will hopefully be back in a couple of weeks. I have Marc Gasol, who is a very good NBA basketball player, still a top 10 center in the NBA. When Conley's healthy, he's a top 10-ish point guard in the NBA, up for debate there. But you have two very good players who, in a muddled Western Conference, can get you a 7 or 8 seed. And that might sound like, oh, God, you want the 7 or 8 seed? You got to raise your standards. The Grizzlies invested so much, guys, in keeping that grit and grind era with Tony Allen and Zach Randolph alive. They took swings for the fences, giving up first-round picks for guys like Jeff Green, trading guys like Rudy Gay for misguided pieces in Tayshaun Prince and Ed Davis, who Tayshaun's an executive with the team now. That's cool, I guess. But what did Memphis really get outside of that in terms of long-term value? Ed Davis is no longer on the Grizzlies, hasn't been there for years. So it's been mismanagement of assets that has led them to this point. And now your most exciting young player on your roster is a guy that you took in the second round. This is not the Philadelphia 76ers process where you've got Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid and all these young guys, Markelle Fultz if he can get healthy. This isn't even the Lakers with Lonzo Ball. You're looking at a team that literally has borderline nothing that is coming up the pike for them. So when you look at that and you look at a tank and you say, oh, yeah, I guess it's cool to tank, but you're giving up a pick in 2 years to Boston because he traded it to them for Jeff Green, what are your options? What are your choices? You try to remain competitive as best you can. You've invested this money in Conley. You've invested in Chandler Parsons, who has been better this year, and you have Gasol. You have to do what you think is best to maximize the years that you have on those contracts. And if David Fizdale and Marc Gasol couldn't see eye to eye, it was easier for Fizdale to go.
My goodness, man. I hate to make it sound like this feels like gloom and doom, Joe, because that's kind of like what it feels like. I mean, look, I'm looking up and down in the Western Conference, and right now, the Memphis Grizzlies are essentially what, 2 games from the 8th spot. I can't believe that when you do have 2 quality players like Marc Gasol and Mike Conley, albeit we knew that, you know, Memphis was rolling the dice. We knew that Chris Wallace and company was rolling the dice by throwing out this ginormous contract for Mike Conley, who has not been a healthy all-star point guard for this basketball team. And yet, you're also talking about an older Marc Gasol. I'm just trying to figure out, at what point do we not start looking at the decision-making process by your GM, where it's easy to go ahead and just take a David Fizdale out of the center of play here, but not look at the moves that have been made over the course of the last 2-3 years with this Grizzlies team that finds itself above water somehow, some way, and not start looking at this and saying, is this GM getting it done for us, or is he now the reason why we're in this situation where we can't tank, like to your point, or not tank, but put ourselves in a position to get quality lottery picks, or be able to move some players that we know, based on the roster that we have, they're not going to win at the capacity that we're seeing the rest of these other Western Conference teams are doing, or even teams in their own division in the Southwest.
I figured you would get to this point, and you're exactly right, because this is the nerve that should be hitting. Because the last time that the Grizzlies fired a coach mid-season, guess who was the general manager of the Memphis Grizzlies? Chris Wallace. He is the common denominator. You talk about looking at all of these moves that have been made and then giving Wallace his due. He's the reason Zach Randolph is in Memphis. He's the reason was in Memphis. He's the reason that Tony Allen came to Memphis. You could argue he is responsible for that grit and grind era that everybody loves so much. You can give him credit for Marc Gasol if you want, but he lucked into Marc Gasol, if we're being honest. Gasol was kind of a throw-in, and it worked out that Marc became roughly as good as Powell, if not better, depending on how you view things. So Chris Wallace is absolutely a problem. And if you talk to Grizzlies fans, if you look at Grizzlies blogs and media, you're terrified of a Chris Wallace rebuild. That's another part of this problem. You have a guy who, you know, and it wasn't his fault that Hasheem Thabeet was drafted, but it's not like Memphis has the best track record with draft picks, at least initially. They leave Memphis and become decent players like Damari Carroll and other guys like that, Kyle Lowry. But of course, Kevin Love, OJ Mayo, that trade situation on draft night all those years ago. People forget that. The Grizzlies drafted Kevin Love, but they traded his rights for OJ Mayo. So there's been a bunch of gaffes along the way that some were Chris Wallace, some were not. But in the most recent times, Wallace has been the guy with his hands on the wheel of this organization. And I think that they stick with Wallace. There's ownership questions, whether or not Para will pay up, if there's challenges from folks within the ownership group in terms of wanting to buy the team. There's a lot of potential turmoil with this roster. I think that it's really likely that this ownership group sees Wallace as a steadying force. Chris Vernon, who's a radio guy in Memphis, or he was a radio guy, he does podcasts. He actually works for the Grizzlies now. In the past, he would interview Wallace on the radio, and he would call him the cockroach of the NBA. And what he meant by that was like he just found a way to survive. He would find ways to kind of move on and find cracks and crevices to keep jobs or find jobs or get back in the league. And that's what he does. And I think that in this case, this particular crevice is the fact that this thing could get really out of control, not just an on-the-court product in the locker room level. This organization could be up in ownership debates and ownership questions. And how much unsteady presence do they want? They may perceive Wallace, as crazy as it sounds, as a steadying force that at least they know he can run the day-to-day operations. I'm not excusing him. I agree with you. I think that you found the main source of the issue, and you probably won't see real change in what Memphis is able to do ceiling-wise until you see change at that general manager position. But again, for reasons that may be outside of the control of any coach or player, he might be safe for now because of being that steadying force.
So I want to touch a little bit on, kind of even going back even more into the Fizdale area. You're not ready to martyr him. Again, he's culpable in this, as many people are in the overall situation. But you touched on the point that I'm not trying to pick it out per se, but was there any type of, from what you can tell, any type of dissension in the locker room? Because I think a lot of people were picking at even the comment that Gasol made in terms of like, well, they wouldn't do this to Mike, and that type of thing. For all I know, Conley and Gasol have been great friends for a very long time, but he may feel like there's unfair treatment towards Conley. Is there some sort of dissension that is a result of maybe Fizdale's treatment of some of the players?
I think it goes back to what I was talking a little bit about earlier in terms of building a culture and how you build a winning basketball team. Mike Conley has bought into David Fizdale, partly because, and I'll disagree a little bit with what you guys were saying earlier, Mike Conley had a career year last year under David Fizdale, over 20 points per game. He wasn't an all-star, but his numbers said he had a darn good season. And against the Spurs in the playoffs, the two best players on the court were Kawhi Leonard and Mike Conley. So I think Conley, when healthy, has lived up to that contract. And Memphis really didn't have any other option. If they were to lose Mike, then what the heck else were they going to do? When Chandler Parsons is your biggest free agent signing in the offseason, it's not like you're a destination that free agents are looking to flock to. But anyway, back to your original point, I think that Mike has bought into what Fizdale is selling, and I don't think Mark has. Mark can be best friends with Mike and have great relationships with him and not necessarily agree professionally. I have friends that I disagree with professionally all the time. I'm sure you guys are the same. I think Mike bought into what Fizdale was selling. Mike wanted to be that kind of leader that Mark didn't want to be. And again, that's not saying that Marc Gasol's not a leader, because he is. He's done a lot of good in the Memphis community. He's helped Deontay Davis is a great example with the young Grizzlies. He's tried to be more positive this year. This is all documented, known information. But I do think that there are aspects of Gasol's personality that don't jive with what Fizdale defines as a leader. And when you're the head coach, you're trying to get that leadership quality out of your guys. And Gasol just wasn't willing to give it. Gasol is stubborn. I think Fizdale was stubborn too. And as I mentioned earlier, it was easier to let go of Fizdale. You can disagree with that decision. I'm not saying I completely agree with it because of the reasons that I mentioned earlier. The team's not healthy. He didn't have a full hand to play, so it's not entirely fair to him. But once you lose your star player, that's kind of where that David Blatt, LeBron thing comes into play. If your star is out on you, it's hard to survive in the NBA. That's just kind of the culture that's there with those superstars. Not saying Gasol is, but in Memphis, it's that best player. You need to have them on your side to have success as a coach.
Okay, when we return, Joe Mullinax will continue to help us break down the fate of the Memphis Grizzlies, parting ways with former head coach David Fizdale and the impact that it's going to have with its fan base and also the NBA community here on the Baseline NBA podcast. We're back, Cal Lee Warren Shaw of the Baseline NBA podcast with our special guest, Joe Mullinax. He is the site manager of SB Nation's Grizzly Bear Blues and also host of the Grizzly Bear Blues Live on Blog Talk Radio as we continue to break down the breaking news with reference to head coach David Fizdale being let go. Joe, I'm still baffled by this a little bit because the way we're having this conversation, we're talking about this as if the Memphis Grizzlies, and this is no disrespect to the Memphis Grizzlies franchise, and certainly no disrespect to the Memphis Grizzlies fan base, which I believe is one of the most passionate fan bases. If there was ever a right move that ever took place when the NBA did its relocation projects, so to speak, moving Vancouver to Memphis, Memphis clearly won out on this, and the NBA fans won out on this because I don't think people really get the opportunity to appreciate the level of success that the Memphis Grizzlies was able to sustain for what they've been doing, given all of what we've been talking about with the crazy flux that has taken place with this organization and how it's treated not just the players, but its coaches. because
Sure.
you'd be hard pressed to explain to me how in through four head coaches, this has still been a basketball team that has managed to win 50 plus basketball games through most of those seasons. And usually that time period where other coaches get like a 4-year, 5-year period of adjustment, that just doesn't seem to happen. And yet they still find a way to win. But I feel like in this sense, the way that we've just talked about David Fizdale, I almost feel like we're talking about this in the sense as if Memphis Grizzlies have a reason or a right to gripe about David Fizdale not holding this thing together while certain things are falling apart. And the prima donna effect that a Marc Gasol has on this organization because of the contract that's been given almost makes it seem like we're talking about them the same way we talk about the Los Angeles Lakers or we talk about, the New York Knicks. And I'm having a hard time trying to correlate to that. Is that what the premise is out there in Memphis because of what just happened here?
No, and I get the frustration. Again, I think David Fizdale is a good basketball coach, and I think he's going to get another opportunity, and he's going to do better there than he did in Memphis. He's going to be the Kyle Lowry or DeMarre Carroll. I think he's going to even maybe have more success, and the jury's still out on Dave Yeager out in Sacramento. But I think Fizdale is going to be a good coach. I think he made mistakes, as I talked about earlier. His rotations were questionable. His play calling and scheme wasn't clicking. But again, it's November, and he didn't have a full set of players. So your critiques and criticisms are completely fair. And a great sign of dysfunction in an organization is overturn at that head coaching position in professional sports or in college sports or in any sport in general. You hire somebody, you give them their opportunity to put in their system. And if it works, it works. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. In the case of the Grizzlies, they've bucked that trend because of the talent they've had. And what I will say, they don't view themselves as the Lakers. To me, it comes down to dollars and cents. Like I mentioned earlier, it is easier to part with a David Fizdale than it is to part with a Marc Gasol. You can't waive Marc Gasol like you can fire David Fizdale. You can pay off that coach's contract, as bad as it sounds. You can't pay off Marc Gasol. You could maybe do the 5-year waive, the stretch provision, but you're losing your best player. And again, you don't have the resources to tank.
But do you not think though, Joe, not to cut you off, but do you not think though that because of the propensity that they're doing this, that this could also make the head coaching position for the Memphis Grizzlies an unattractive job, in order, and I'm going to also throw this out there on a limb, that now we're talking about GMs and head coaches and they're to be synonymous with each other in the way that you attract free agents that want to come play for a team, especially when we talk about, quote unquote, the word small market. But I'm just saying this kind of turnover, I have to think is an adverse effect in the way that you go about attracting the idea of anyone coming to Memphis to make this team, I think, what everyone is envisioning it to be.
I think that's fair, and I think you can see the reaction of NBA players on Twitter as a great example of that. LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, who played for Fizdale, and then guys who didn't even play for Fizdale. The frustration that you saw. I think that when you see somebody like Vince Carter, who by all accounts is a class act, everybody loved Vince from his time in Memphis, wished he had stayed even though he's 40 years old. Obviously, he made his money in Sacramento. Good for him. He should have taken that deal, and Memphis was wise to not pay him. But when you see Vince Carter being surprised by that, being frustrated by that, there's a layer there. And I think that you're right to question the Grizzlies' thought process in that mode. But again, they are in an extremely difficult spot, and I think Fizdale was a victim of circumstance. They don't have the pieces to properly tank. They probably don't think that they can get for Gasol what it would take to be able to properly tank. And because of all of that, because of those issues, you're now in a place where you have over $75 million a year invested in 3 players. You want to see if between them and Tyreek Evans and JaMychal Green, if you can get them healthy, you get JB Bickerstaff, who is an interim coach, who has shown in the past that he can turn these things around. He has a track record of being able to do that. Maybe you salvage this season. Now, the unique thing that will come of this is JB Bickerstaff is good friends with David Fizdale. if he does, if I am Bickerstaff, going off of what you've been talking about, I don't disagree necessarily. I am coaching my ass off the next 6 months to get this team to the 6th seed potentially. And JB Bickerstaff, turn it around, coach of the year. And then I'm leaving Memphis on the first plane for the first job that comes open. And I am taking this platform and I'm showing, hey, I can take this crap situation and I can turn it into something positive. And that's kind of what they run the risk of being. As far as a free agent destination, Memphis was never that. And they had to overpay Chandler Parsons to come. I think Portland didn't want to offer the full max, or maybe they were close to it and didn't. Memphis did, and I think that they were right to do it because Parsons at the time was what they needed. But at the same time, that's how you're going to get those kinds of players in Memphis anyway. So if the way that you're going to rebuild is through the draft, and if you don't really have full functioning yearly draft picks until the year 2020 or 2021, you might as well run out these next few years with Gasol and Conley and see if you can do the best you can, and then you start your rebuild then. Because to blow it up, to trade Mark, to get rid of him, to keep Fizdale, that would really have weakened the organization to a point where I don't think you see them having success at all and not being able to, as crazy as it sounds, again, the Sixers found ways to reap the benefits of losing. The Grizzlies wouldn't be able to reap those benefits. And I think that's the best way to explain it, not necessarily saying I agree with it. I think Fizdale is a victim of circumstance. He took a couple of bad steps in the wrong direction, and it cost him in Memphis.
Final one here before I let you get out of here, Joe. Burning the midnight oil, as we said, alluded to. You mentioned JB Bickerstaff a little while ago. Just kind of what can the expectation be, for him? Even again, maybe in terms of tightening up those rotations and things. What has Grizzlies Nation, in essence, been clamoring for? Have they been looking? Do they want more Brooks out there? Do they want, more of any James Ennis out there? I mean, I have no idea. What can he do to kind of help this in the interim time while they're still obviously very banged up?
Well, I think that they're looking for execution, and I think that that's a fair criticism of David Fizdale. Was it worth him losing his job? I don't know. I'd battle with that. I have battled with that the past 8 or 9 hours. But one of the criticisms of him has been the defensive schemes that he's implemented. They haven't been fully functioning properly. The switches have been sloppy. The Grizzlies are leaving multiple three-point shooters wide open consistently. On the offensive end, it's a lot of isolation. It's a lot of pick and roll with guys just standing there. So for me, the expectation with Bickerstaff is to just get these guys moving on offense and get them understanding where they're supposed to be better on defense. Bickerstaff's strength is supposed to be the defensive side of the ball. Hopefully we see some improvement on that end because it hasn't been there. And again, it takes players to win. If you don't have the full hand, it's hard to play cards. Like I talked about with Fizdale, you can make the argument that he didn't have a fair shake this season in showing what he can do. But now that we're in this place, you can look at the critiques of Fizdale that were fair and see if Bickerstaff can improve those things, help the Grizzlies keep their head above water because they've got the Spurs twice, and then they've got the Cleveland Cavaliers. This losing streak can easily turn into 11 or 12. They have to find a way to kind of tread water until Mike Conley comes back and then see if they can make a little bit of a run to try to get back to 500. That's the sad state of affairs. And like I said, David Fizdale deserves some blame for that. Did he deserve to lose his job? I'm not so sure.
He is the man, and I'm telling you, boy, he makes Grizzly Bears want to take a couple of Prozacs to stay up, to catch up what's going on with Memphis. He's our brother for another mother, Joe Mullinax. He is the site manager for SB Nation's Grizzly Bear Blues, and you can also check out the Grizzly Bear Blues live show on Blog Talk Radio. Joe, man, thanks so much for staying up late with us to help make sense of this crazy last 9 hours with the firing of Coach David Fizdale, brother.
It's hard to make sense of it, guys. I completely understand that. And what I will tell your listeners, because I know you got lots of them, this is a situation that we will probably never know the full story. That there's stuff that'll be said off the record to people that are on the ground in Memphis that they'll never tell. Maybe it would make for a good 30 for 30 someday. We're going off of what we see on the surface, but I can tell you now there's more to this than just what we're seeing.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, man, but the Fizz just got grizzed. So we're gonna see what happens with Memphis moving forward, and hopefully they will snap out of this losing streak. But it's gonna be tough, man. It's gonna be tough. Once again,
It
man.
is going to be tough.
Yeah, listen. I feel for you over there, man. You know what I'm saying, but I know you're gonna keep trekking on. I know you're gonna be all right.
Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate you guys. I love the show. Happy to come on anytime. Hopefully under happier circumstances next time.
Most
Anytime, happy to come on. Thank you, guys.
most definitely, brother.
Still aftermath, and ain't nothing after that.
All right, man. Right up into that aftermath. Cali, Warren Shaw, the Baseline NBA podcast, and awesome interview from our man Joe Mullinax, host of the Grizzly Bear Blues Live on Blog Talk Radio and site manager for SB Nation's Grizzly Bear Blues. And listen, I completely get where he's coming from, and maybe in some way, shape, or form, because it's crazy late on his thing. He's trying to wipe the sleep out of his eyes and stuff. I feel I really feel some kind of way about this, because I just feel like the Memphis fan base is being dealt an unfair hand, more so than we're talking about David Fizdale, because of how this situation played itself out. And on the same token of this, Shaw, there is going to be some kind of backlash that is, and a possible CK is going to be attached to the forehead of Marc Gasol, because he might be labeled as a coach killer simply because of how the circumstance played out, which I don't think is a direct reason for David Fizdale being fired. However, you'd be hard-pressed to tell me that the ownership and Chris Wallace didn't almost make it seem that way because of the timeliness, because of the timeline of the events.
Yeah, they control the narrative, I think, very much so, especially after Gasol's, pseudo outbursts. And I think most people around the league, and even those, just kind of on Twitter and things like that, they just know Gasol to kind of be a good dude and just to be a competitor. So I don't quite think it'll get to the coach killer standpoint or viewpoint from Gasol. But again, they did paint a narrative in some way that, okay, well, you could blame Gasol a little bit for it, you could blame Fizdale for it, and kind of diverting attention away from the root of the problem, as Joe alluded to, which is really the front office, and they've just haven't done a great job. And he hammered home this point, and I hope our listeners were definitely tuning into this, and we've been saying it. I think everybody who has common sense, that they were holding on to the grit and grind era way, way, way too long, and as a result, they made some poor decisions that cost them draft picks, that cost them even good players in some instances, as they tried to get what they thought were upgrades. Yeah, and that to me is really where this all stems from. Again, grit and grind lasted way too long, maybe 2 years too long, I'd say probably. And if they would have started kind of moving in the other direction, with Gasol or without Gasol, or maybe even without Conley and that massive contract he does have now, maybe this is a different situation that we're in right now. But nevertheless, I think the Memphis fan base has been treated to, a team that they could get behind, they could really love and support. And maybe that meant more to them overall. But right now, it seems to be kind of dire times. As we record an 8-game losing streak, Gasol, not happy. Conley hurt. Parsons re-injured his knee. We just got done talking about how great Tyreek Evans has been, despite it being a losing situation. But this Grizzlies team just doesn't have a whole lot going for them, unfortunately, outside of Gasol.
You touched on something just a moment ago, real quick, Shaw. And it really it baffles me, because as I read through most of these articles about what may have transpired between David Fizdale and the Memphis Grizzly organization, the one person who I really don't hear talking is the owner, Robert Pera. And this now is starting to become somewhat of a trend. And you begin to wonder where he is in all of this. You're only as good as what your ownership's passion, I feel like, shows you. And sometimes it doesn't have to necessarily be him cutting checks or, whatever's coming out of his pockets. Sometimes it's just his overall presence in the locker room, in the way that he embraces the whole mantra, and what we even talk about, the whole quote unquote grit and grind thing. I don't know, maybe, he's not a true believer of it, or was a firm believer of it. But just his silence in this, to me, is also something that starts to concern me about whether or not his true focus and vested interest is on the betterment of this basketball team, which has been going through some really tough stretches despite having winning basketball seasons?
Yeah, it's a catch-22, I think, for any owner, right? How much do you come out and make comments? I think the obvious comparison is, all right, do you want a Mark Cuban or do you want a Pat Riley? And I think there's maybe somewhere in the middle of that. Riley speaks maybe twice a year in public, and when he speaks, it's very meaningful. Whereas Cuban, he's on Twitter, he's on social media, he's everywhere every single day making comments about his team, his roster, and pretty much anything else. And I think in the case of Perry, he's tried to maybe just let this team be the team and speak and be the voice, that he wants to have, for his organization. And I guess that's it's a hard, again, it's a catch-22. I don't know if I was for what exactly I would say, especially in a case like this where it is we have some circumstantial evidence right now when it comes to the Fizdale and Gasol case. And I think what Joe said was very poignant and can't be overstated, is that we're never really going to know the truth behind the situation. Again, it would make for great 30 for 30, as he alluded to, or some investigative reporting, or maybe a Woj podcast. Maybe Woj gets Fizdale to come on one day and he's like, hey, man, spit it out. Because I think Fizz, you're not going to rook him, right? So he may do a tell.
I was waiting for one of us to throw it out there. If it wasn't going to be Joe, I was hoping it was going to be you.
But he may do like kind of a tell-all show, if you will. Like, listen, here's what went down. And, I'm not happy about it, but nevertheless, hey, you got to move on. Or he may stay silent because he also doesn't want to be seen as a snitch. And he's going to want to get another job in the NBA and should have another job in the NBA. I live obviously in the South Florida area, and there's all these questions and conversations about, well, hey, the Heat still have 2 open assistant coaches positions where he could just come right back down here and sit right next to Spoelstra, and at least for the rest of this season. And then maybe he bolts again sometime in the summer, man. But, in the case of Parra not saying much, I'm not too much on that because I think it's a catch-22 for any.
All right, so now let's quickly focus our attention, Shaw. JB Bickerstaff, listen, man, he's the replacement coach whisperer. Okay, he's getting his second go around and messing around with this. Are we expecting the Memphis Grizzlies to show some semblance of success under him, throughout the course of throughout the remainder of this season?
Well, I don't know how it can be any different other than the fact that he just probably doesn't bench Gasol at the end of the day, because until they get healthy, what difference does this all really make at the end of the day? Like, really and truly. So if Conley's not back, in a week or so, if Parsons is going to continue to be banged up, God forbid Tyreek goes down with one of the many injuries he seems to always suffer as well too, then what will really be different other than the fact, hey, we won't bench Gasol in the fourth quarter anymore? So I think he's playing with house money for the most part. If guys do come back and get healthy, then hey, great. And then they make a run and do this thing and wonderful. But even if they don't, I don't think anybody had expectations for the Grizzlies to be all that great this season. And when they started off the season, decent, playing above 500 and being very competitive, that was a little bit of fool's gold, for sure. And now they've regressed back to the mean and to who they really are. And it's just that it's unfortunate that it's coming in an 8-game losing streak. You know what I mean? Them being 7-12 isn't necessarily way off from where people thought they'd be, but they didn't think, they'd be 7-4 to start it and then go on an 8-game losing streak. So it's just kind of how those wins and losses kind of stack up that's played this situation.
Well, as we said before, the Memphis Grizzlies are only 2 games out from the 8th position. Still a whole lot of basketball to be played, but certainly they're not trending in an up direction, and it's very, very uncertain what the future is like. But one thing is definitely certain: that future will certainly not have David Fizdale behind it for the Memphis Grizzlies. This has been an awesome show, Shaw. I mean, what more can be said? We're so fortunate to have our man Joe Mullinax on board to kind of help us break things down. And I know people get caught up in the gossip hype about what may have happened, the drama and this, that, and the third. For us, I think the most important thing is about the short-term and long-term impact that these decisions that are being made, not to just a basketball team, but possibly a basketball community, how this may impact them moving forward. And look, there's no getting around it. The Memphis Grizzlies are going to have worse days before they find the better ones, and this happens to be one of those worst days when you're firing a head coach only 19 games out of an 82-game regular season.
Yep, man. Yeah, they chop real quick, man. It's and I it's one of those situations where were you when this happened? And I was at work and kind of just doing my thing, and all of a sudden get the notification from Woj, and I'm like, what? Like, no, that can't be right. And, there's other guys out there. I think it was Michael Lee from The Vertical. He said, listen, he didn't believe it. He thought, he was being catfished by a fake Woj account. There's no way. He's checking the blue verification. There's no way that the Grizzlies would act this harshly as a result of, an 8-game losing streak and then what Gasol had said the previous evening. So, but at the end of the day, it seems like something that was kind of on the boiler maybe for a little while now, and we don't know if Fizdale, no matter what would have happened if he would have finished things out, if things were truly this rough within their locker room.
All right. Well, there you have it. All that combined, man, we're now going to be focused on, what's going to happen to the Memphis Grizzlies moving forward. For the baseline, Cali, Warren Shaw. Once again, we'd like to thank our man Joe Mullinax from Grizzly Bears Blues. Be sure to check out his show on Blog Talk Radio and also check out his articles that they drop via SB Nation. For the baseline, Cali, Warren Shaw. We appreciate you guys. You know we do. And we'll catch up with you next time.